Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Journal Club of VAC4EU. This is the first session of the 2026, and I think we are starting great. So we start with Ashton. Ashton is the currently communication officer for VAC4EU. She supports the network communication, dissemination activity, and social media management, website content, and many other things. So the title of today is Uncertainty in Science. Should we say more or less? So Ashton will guide us through this paper, and we will discuss how scientists perceive the nature of science and the value for communication. I think maybe we can get this started. And please, Ashton, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's start with kind of getting on the same page about what the nature of science is. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to abbreviate this as NOS just for brevity. NOS is a concept that actually comes from sociology and philosophy. So the main goal of it is to see how it works, its epistemological and ontological underpinnings, and also the relationship it has with society as a whole. And throughout the paper, the authors use a particular framework that they call the family resemblance approach. So this can be explained in terms of family resemblance. So here you see three siblings, A, B, and C. And you can see that A and B have wavy hair while C has straight hair. On the other hand, B and C are rather short, but A is tall. And A and C have green eyes, but B has blue eyes. So this is kind of similar to the way the family resemblance approach sees science. So you can consider, for example, geology, microbiology, and climate science. Although these are all sciences, they don't really share one universal characteristic. In terms of methodology, certainly not. So geology and microbiology use physical samples, while climate science doesn't necessarily do that. Geology and climate science also both have long-term studies that unfold over long periods of time, while microbiology is shorter. And microbiology and climate science are more about controlled experiments, while in geology, you can't exactly experimentally manipulate the Earth's systems. So the family resemblance approach also has 11 different components. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but they're organized in three general categories. So the core ones are at the individual scientific level. So individuals, what methodologies they use and the practices that underpin these, the aims, values, and goals that they have, and also how knowledge is organized. The characteristics in the example I gave earlier with microbiology and climate science and geology are all part of this inner ring. But you also have, zooming out from here, the more scientific community level activities. So this is professional activities like going to conferences, social values, social certification, which refers to the peer review process, and also the scientific ethos, which is the norms of the field. And then zooming out from there, you have politics, money, and social organizations, which, like it or not, they do influence the way science is conducted and also the impact that it's allowed to have. So moving on into the actual paper. So this is the prior research that they brought in. So first of all, why is NOS important at all for scientific learning? So a lot of scholars have actually advocated for improving education on this already, because a lot of research has shown that understanding NOS and being able to apply it across diverse contexts is necessary for critical evaluation at all. And they repeatedly come back to a concept called socioscientific issues, and they abbreviate this as SSI. So these are huge issues that have some kind of scientific basis, but don't only include science. So this would be things like climate change or COVID are good examples of this. There was a study that was done in 2024 that showed that STEM majors actually demonstrated better vaccine acceptance and stronger trust in science when they were given contextually relevant NOS topics. So in this case, it was how COVID and vaccine research are amendatory and revisionary and change over time based on new information being presented. So the authors then reasoned that targeted NOS communication could actually help promote public trust in science. For example, related to science in the making and how good science is how good science is done, for example. So in terms of public understanding of these concepts, the public is pretty much not educated on NOS, even if they have an interest in science. So as a kind of shocking example, STEM majors are actually no less likely to hold NOS misconceptions and have pseudoscientific beliefs than anyone else. Obviously, this has implications for how people evaluate SSI. So another example would be that actually people who hold the belief that science only consists of controlled experiments are slightly more likely to believe in climate change denialism. And also there's inconsistencies in where people hear this kind of information. So most NOS learning takes place in formal settings like K through 12 education primarily. So there you would learn about the scientific method, the importance of empiricism, observation and experimentation, etc. But it's often very simply presented and it doesn't go much deeper than that. And another important point is that the vast majority of life, 97% plus, takes place outside of these formal learning environments. So, and we are regularly bombarded with some kind of scientific informations or claims or things like this in these contexts. So social media, personal interactions with people, science museums, parks, pop science literature, advertising, doctor's appointments. There are all kinds of places where we're asked to evaluate scientific claims. And it's reasonable that these are actually more impactful on shaping what people's perceptions are of NOS than the random critical thinking class they took in high school. So unfortunately, though, there is not really accurate NOS messaging accompanying this scientific information the majority of the time. And there's also a very high chance of mis or disinformation. I probably don't need to tell you how rife with misinformation social media is, but just in case you're curious about the data behind this, research has shown that up to 29% of social media posts about COVID-19 had some form of misinformation in them. And then to add to this, public decision-making is extremely difficult, especially with SSI like COVID, because science recommendations change constantly with new information. So what exactly is the role of scientists here? I also don't need to tell you this, but there's a lot that's put on scientists that goes well beyond what they're supposed to do in the laboratory or in a classroom. So yes, they're the primary producers of research, but they're also asked to present on their findings, both to peers and to the public and to regulators and all kinds of stakeholders. And they're expected to listen to the public and ensure that their research is relevant to them and society as a whole. And these efforts are pretty widespread and not necessarily acknowledged. There's been a little bit of acknowledgement about this dual role as science producer and communicator more recently, although it's primarily hinged on a deficit model of science communication. So this assumes that the public is pretty much just doesn't know the scientific facts, and that if they know the facts, then they'll be informed. So as a result, the training that scientists receive, if they receive it at all, is about public speaking and social media skills, basically how to disseminate facts rather than crafting meaningful messages or how to the strategies to actually promote trust in science. So the authors then feel that the next steps is to prepare scientists to address NOS and promote trust. Although there's been very little scholarship on this, truly investigating what scientists really think of this and their potential as educators. However, there's been quite a bit of research on K through 12 science educators and how these things affect their teaching process. So this body of research consistently shows that their perspectives do inform their educational practice. And the better educated they are on NOS, the better educators they are in science. And the little work that has been done on scientists themselves show that while they are capable of understanding NOS once you explain it to them, their views are pretty diverse and unfortunately not always aligned with what has been agreed by NOS scholars. So obviously this is quite important on dispelling misconceptions, but not everyone agrees on how this could be done. So some people think that scientists' perspectives could be used as a way to humanize science, and it would also make it seem more exciting, which might make people more enthusiastic in general and thus promoting trust. Although some people think that it could also expose some complex nuance that's a little bit ugly and difficult to explain. For example, how sociocultural values might influence the way scientists conduct science. And this might in turn promote distrust in science. We don't really know what scientists' conceptions of NOS even are, though, let alone how to position them or how to promote public trust. So the authors say, let's start there. So the purpose of the study is to explore views on NOS, look into the nuanced rationales and values that scientists have in addressing it in public contexts. And the research questions were, how do scientists perceive the value of communicating NOS to the public, and what factors are associated with their communication values? They used surveys and also semi-structured interviews, and the participants were 14 faculty members from the same large American research university. And they come from quite a diverse array of different disciplines: physics, biology, chemistry, animal sciences, veterinary pathobiology, and plant sciences. Unfortunately, there were no pharmacoepidemiologists in the bunch, not even any public health, anything remotely public health related. So maybe we can bridge that gap today. So the surveys were mostly Likert style, but also some open-ended questions. And the purpose of them was to measure NOS conceptions on some 4 different preset dimensions that they identified, which are loosely mapped to the concepts of the family resemblance approach that I shared earlier. And the interviews were between 30 and 60 minutes, and they were semi-structured. So they were allowed to diverge a bit from the preset script, but they basically asked about prior outreach to the public and what sort of practices they value in communication of their work, how they define science, what they prioritize or understand when it comes to NOS, and also how important they rate different NOS dimensions. And they were also asked what sort of influences they think are, or what sort of things might influence their views. So the surveys were scored based on how they align with the contemporary NOS scholarship. And the interviews were coded using the family resemblance approach, but there was also room for emergent themes as well. And I've combined the findings and discussion section here because otherwise it would have been a lot of repetition, and I wanted to keep the presentation relatively short to leave room for discussion. But firstly, let's talk about the views that they had on communicating NOS. In general, they strongly value doing so, communicating in NOS. However, some fear that this could be boring to the public, or worse, it could be polarizing. And they also expressed a desire to tailor the messaging for different audiences based on NOS. And a nice quote that I found here was one of the pros would be a better understanding and appreciation of science and scientists. People would be better able to read the news and interpret and critique things for themselves, make their own decisions, ultimately impacting things like policy, hopefully. The prior scholarship that the authors point out is that it's not exactly unfounded that they might be afraid of polarizing an effect a polarization, because there are actually many things that can affect an individual's evaluation of claims, including politics and interest in the topic, and religion and sociocultural background, and all kinds of things. But prior scholarship has also found that tailoring messaging is found to be beneficial. So authors recommend supporting scientists in tailoring messaging and ensuring that messaging is actually relevant to the target audience. So what were the scientists' actual understanding of NOS? Unfortunately, there were some participants in the study that had some somewhat incorrect misconceptions. For example, the idea that science follows a rigid, empirical, step-by-step method across all subfields. That was an idea that was endorsed by 5 out of 14 of the participants. And most of the other participants had very mixed views on this that were kind of halfway correct, halfway incorrect. And only 2 actually correctly pointed out the folly in this. This is a little bit disturbing because in previous research, it's been found that science educators who hold this view have not been able to teach science appropriately. So the authors assume that this pattern holds for scientists and science communication, although this is an assumption. So the authors do recommend to clarify the relationship between NOS understanding and whether or not they can be effective as a science communicator. And if this turns out to be the same type of relationship, then it's logical to then educate scientists to strengthen their own conceptions of NOS in order to ensure that they can be effective science communicators. The scientists in the study did point out quite a few barriers that they had to effectively communicating NOS. So one is financial. Public outreach is not financially rewarded. And also there were a few scientists who were very frustrated by the political climate and pointed out that it really constrains their messaging and is ultimately a very frustrating to be a science communicator in certain environments. So as an example for the funding one, this person says, if the university and the funding agencies are rewarding you for your research and very little for anything else, then with few exceptions, that's what people are going to do. This person is more about the political side of things. So they say that this just that's nothing to do with science, referring to misconceptions here. That just has to do with their own political will or philosophy about how they view the future. You know, I'm not going to stop driving my big truck, but I'm totally fine just spending all my tax dollars to go to another planet and try to make it green. What? So I don't waste my time trying to tell people what science is if that's the reality of how people perceive the world, right? So prior scholarship on this in terms of barriers is that science communication training is pretty inconsistent and also doesn't really happen. I already mentioned this in the literature review. As I mentioned there, it tends to not be really focused on specific strategies and is more about just disseminating facts. So the authors recommend investigating ways to improve science communication training for resources, for researchers as well. Generally speaking, most people were very interested in communicating about the societal benefit of science. I think like 11 out of, I didn't write this down, but I think 11 out of 14 scientists brought this up. Although they had a rather mixed understanding on how exactly science solves SSI fully, and they didn't necessarily bring up other tools that might be used to combat these issues. There was generally an assumption that the more you communicate about societal benefit, the more public support you end up with. So this person, for example, says they should be a little bit more focused on how science is potentially helping society, and to have the citizens believing that would help the entire process, and it might even help with funding. So the authors point out that actually politics and religion are stronger predictors of funding attitudes than actual knowledge on these things. And also there is not really any empirical research that connects that shows the idea that communicating about societal benefits equals more public support. Also, the authors point out that emphasizing the way science can solve these things does undermine other solutions for things, and also tends to ignore some of the negative consequences of promoting technocentric societies, as they call them. So they recommend avoiding focusing messaging solely on societal benefit, and that there should be a little more nuance here. So science is only one of many epistemic tools, et cetera, et cetera. Regarding methodology, there were also very diverse views on whether and how to communicate about methods. Many endorsed explaining the scientific method, for example, although their notions on this were not always accurate. And prior scholarship shows that having the idea that science is a rigid step-by-step empirical process and doesn't involve any creativity or anything is actually a viewpoint that climate change denialists use to spread misinformation. So also, I mentioned this earlier with the STEM majors, but being aware of how to do science does not necessarily equate to having accurate views on NOS. So the authors recommend supporting scientists in strengthening their alignment on NOS, and also working together to craft consistent and accessible messaging about methodology. Regarding subjectivity, there was definitely reluctance on this. Many scientists were very concerned that this could negatively impact trust. Although there were a few who valued communicating things like the peer review process, consensus building, and the collaborative element. So regarding the first point, this person says, the bigger crisis is the distrust that the public has for scientists. Building up trust before we say also we're fallible and we have some things to work on is important because some of them have the motivation to not believe what they say. Regarding the second point, this person says, it does come back to the really important idea that I think the general public needs to understand is that the idea of science building on itself, and that through the accumulation of evidence, that's what leads us to a conclusion or getting closer to an answer. This person says, we just need people to understand that the majority meets. That is an aggregate. You can't trust any one study. Even in my own work, I know I'm going to make a mistake. Somebody else might find something down the line that modifies it. That's good. That's progress. I want that to happen. You don't ever take one research study as gospel truth. So the authors point out that trust in science has decreased over the past 30 years. Shocker. And of course, COVID made this quite a bit worse. There was a general perception among many people in the public that scientists are motivated by money and subjective whims. And the authors also cite research that suggests that claiming objectivity actually decreases public trust in the long run once they figure out that it's not actually objective and that they are indeed fallible. So the authors recommend emphasizing the self-corrective and consensus-building nature of science, and also communicating how individual scientists strive for objectivity, but that this isn't necessarily possible. So it's about doing so to the extent that it is possible and providing nuance as to how and when it is. So the overall conclusions, and then briefly the limitations. So one interesting thing that they pointed out was that these interviews occurred just after COVID-19. So the authors, some of the interviews did, not all of them. They think that maybe the results could have been influenced by this. You can imagine that people might have been particularly frustrated by certain aspects of the world at that particular moment. It might have made them more passionate than normal. Also, not everybody completed the survey. It was quite a small sample size and at only a single institution. And they also noted that trying to stick to the family resemblance approach was a little bit difficult. And so they ended up with a lot of emergent codes that were not part of their framework. Their overall conclusions are that scientists are motivated to communicate about NOS, but they are not necessarily prepared to do so. And they also think that messaging to the public should differ depending on whether it's for a well-established and non-contentious topic or something that's more uncertain, novel, emerging kind of thing. Scientists should also resist the temptation to emphasize social utility too much. There should be more of an emphasis instead on expertise, peer review, revision, how and when to trust science, et cetera, et cetera. So put briefly, the implications here are to build accurate NOS understanding first, be socioculturally responsive, and collaborate on issue-specific messaging. And that is it for me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashton. It was a really clear and perfect presentation. It was really, really interesting. Thank you very much.